Hello. Now, hey everybody. I like your Cubs hat, by the way. Welcome. I have the pleasure of introducing two of the most renowned and talented pollsters in America. John Anzalone, who has polled for probably hundreds of Democratic candidates over the course of your career, including Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden in 2020. Tony Fabrizio, who is equally renowned on the Republican side and has been involved in national political polling for 3 decades or more, and has been the pollster for President Trump. But before we get into any of that, I want you guys to talk about your origin stories in polling and in politics, because tell me just a little bit about where you began in life and how you got drawn into it. And because I want to make a point about this when you guys are done.
Sure. Thanks. Thank you for having us here. Actually, I think one of the reasons that Tony and I became really good friends, even though we're on different ideological.
Said he's got batshit crazy ideas.
Two 60 plus Italian American guys, right? What could go wrong with that relationship? Is that, I think that we both had maybe grind and struggle growing up, him on Long Island, me right across from Chicago in St. Joe, Michigan. My dad was a Teamster and disabled truck driver. He had a great line. He said, I didn't know I was a Democrat till Mr. Hoffa told me so, which was Jimmy Hoffa. He was local 7 Teamsters out of Kalamazoo. But we were just we had a normal middle class life until he became disabled, right? And I think I was 8 years old, and everything changes at that point. And I was telling David this morning on a walk, the two things that I was fortunate. I mean, there's a lot of people who grew up free lunch kids, which I was, but they don't always grow up in a place that actually had a good school system. And that was my saving grace. And my mom got a job at the county mental hospital as a switchboard operator after a bunch of menial jobs. So we got health care, right? And so you can grow up poor, but that's actually pretty on the high spectrum. And I had a really loving Italian American family where, I always felt loved. I was just poor, right? So, had a lot of people who, quite frankly, looked out for me and was able, always started working when I was 11 years old, shining shoes. But, even though at the time it was really tough financially and potentially emotionally, there was a lot of actually good in it too, in terms of, what we learned and what we saw. And I think that I've always brought that into kind of what I do, is trying not to forget all the middle class people who I grew up with. I grew up with no one who went to college. Like literally until my brother went to college, there was zero. All of my parents' friends, all of the relatives, all the grandparents, all of their friends, they were all blue collar people. And they were great people. And unfortunately, they all now vote for Trump.
So, but talk about how then you got into politics. And there are probably some young people here.
Yeah, no, I think that the best
and into polling.
Best thing about what I tell everyone who's interested in politics, who's young, is go out there and get on a campaign. Doesn't matter how big or small. Matter of fact, it's better if it's small because you'll have a bigger role. And so I started literally as a field organizer for a guy named Joe Biden, who was running for president. And it was 1987 in Des Moines, Iowa. I was the first guy out there. And from there went on.
What happened to that?
Yeah, right. That one didn't work out well.
Drove him, right?
I did. I drove him around. I drove him. It was great. Being at the very beginning of a campaign, it's you and the candidate, right? And a couple other people. And he gives you a nickname, and it's just a wonderful experience. But from there, went on and managed a congressional and political director for a U.S. Senate race, managed a big city mayor's race, managed a big governor's race. So you got to get out there and get the experience. And, at the beginning, everyone is bottom feeders. You're doing the smallest task, but you're part of a team and you learn experiences. My son, who just graduated last May, did his first campaign in North Carolina for Josh Stein. And he was the lowest guy in the campaign, and he had a great experience. And now he can't wait to do the next race. And
how did you make the switch to polling?
It was life. It was like, I was getting married and I was kind of scared, right? Like I wanted to keep going. I had just done a governor's race, and the pollster was Greg Schneider, who became my polling mentor. And they offered me a job. I'd always been good with numbers. I was, once I started in campaigns, I would look at the polling like it was a Bible, and I would, ask a lot of questions, and I would spend hours and hours with crosstabs and things like that. And so I went to work for a polling firm, and it's different than I think maybe a media firm, et cetera. I don't know what your experience, Tony, but there's an apprentice kind of time. I mean, I felt like I apprenticed for 3 years, learning the trade of being a pollster and using my campaign management or operative experience in weaving that in. And I think the combination of the fact that I had real campaign experience was incredibly important and served me incredibly well in terms of how I was able to give strategic advice to campaigns, and eventually moved out of DC and spent the last 30 years outside of DC. And I thought that was very helpful as well in terms of not getting kind of caught up into the DC narrative. Tony lives in Fort Lauderdale. Did his career in Chicago. I think there's something very unique and helpful about our perspective, which, by the way, isn't the DC perspective.
Tony, you actually have kind of a parallel story.
Very similar. Grew up in Brooklyn. My family my grandparents came from Italy. My dad was a construction laborer, a union member. My mom was a stay-at-home wife. My dad never completed past 7th grade in school. And he took a chance, started his own business, made enough money that they were able to buy a house in Long Island. So it was part of the whole white ethnic flight from the urban areas to the suburban areas. And we moved out to Long Island. And, my mother was the oldest of 9. My father was the youngest of 9. I'm the oldest of 38 grandchildren on my mother's side, and I'm in the middle of like 25 on my father's side. So I have to be on Facebook just to find out what my cousins are doing, because there's no chance we ever get together. But when we do, it's a huge blowout at like a family wedding or something like that. When we moved to Long Island, I'd always kind of been interested in politics. I was kind of a quasi fan of Nixon's, but really was a huge fan of Ronald Reagan's. And when we moved to Long Island, a friend of mine in high school said, you ought to come and join the Young Republicans. And I was like, I went, I joined, and before I knew it, I ended up being the president of the Young Republicans, and then moved up the Young Republican ladder. And in Nassau County, as you know, David, that was like the thing. It was truly a political,
Nassau
machine.
County had a huge Republican machine.
Yes, it was a part of the machine. And when you were, like a young Republican leader, you actually had power. So like I would give out all the summer jobs for my township. So I'd give out hundreds of summer jobs. So like every friend I had, everybody I knew, they were either collecting garbage, working as lifeguards, stuff like that. And, I'm like 16, 17 years old, and I'm giving out all these jobs. Was probably not the best way to learn about politics. But I then got sucked into doing a campaign. I was field director on a congressional race, and very fortunate. Sometimes being at the right place at the right time is so important. It's life-changing. And I met the guy who would become my mentor in the business, a guy named Arthur Finkelstein, who at that point in time, I didn't even know, what do we need a pollster for? The way you win campaigns is you give out
summer
stickers.
jobs.
Right, you give out summer jobs. You give out bumper stickers. You put up yard signs, and that's how you won campaigns. And I started questioning him about all of this, and my guy lost, but very narrowly in 1978, so a little bit older than him. But he likes to rub it in, but we don't talk about it. But my guy ran again in 1980, and I did the campaign. I was basically the campaign manager. And in that campaign, I really got exposed to polling and the whole, kind of like panoply of things that campaigns do, because we did TV ads, we did direct mail. These are all things that back in 1980 were not commonplace in congressional races by any stretch. And in fact, Arthur's aide de camp then was a guy named Alex Castellanos.
Oh, yes.
So I'm sure both of you know very well. He's one of the most prominent Republican media guys.
Yes.
And I went after that and did another congressional race and the Senate race for him. And then he said, come to work for me. And so very much like John, I apprenticed for 2 cycles under him because, and John's right. I tell people all the time, when they say, how do I get into politics? I tell them, go do a campaign.
Yeah.
And the benefit of having managed campaigns and learning to do polling, instead of just going and learning to do polling, is you learn the breadth of all the things a campaign has to do. And so how the media fits with the comms and how all of the different pieces fit. It's changed, but we have to keep and adapt to the change.
Well, let me follow up on that. And I want to ask both of you this question. You've been in the business a long time, and technology has churned and it's changed dramatically. Tell me how polling and research have changed over the course of your career, and how do you use it now in ways that you could never have used it then? And I assume that the accumulation of data that you can do now is at the core of this.
Well, if you listen to President Trump, I'm too expensive and I don't make the phone calls. So that's changed. The technology has changed such that it doesn't matter because I obviously don't make the phone calls. I think John and I were just talking about it in the hold room before we came in. I think, when I first started doing this, we did everything on paper, and we used to have it key punched onto IBM 80 column key punch cards. And we used to have to go in the middle of the night to run the jobs on leased computer time back in the early 80s, because nobody had mainframe computers. You didn't have a mainframe computer. My iPhone has more power probably than that mainframe computer had at the time. And then you still had to do door-to-door interviews in some states because phone landline penetration, like in a state like Montana and Idaho, was not universal. Today, it's become such a challenge. John, please chime in for us, because it used to be that everybody had a landline, you get everybody. Then cell phone changed that. Then response rates changed how you got people. And then it was, well, maybe online was the answer. And now we've moved to SMS to web technology to try to get voters who don't want to talk to live operators, who don't have the time to do it. They take it at their own time. But it's going to continue to morph. And the thing that everybody talks about is, how will AI affect the future? And my answer to that is, AI can certainly do all of the backroom stuff. The one thing AI can't replace is my experience or his experience in looking at the numbers. You can't teach that to a machine yet. And by the time that happens, I'll be out of retired.
We'll be out of it. But just to add to that, a couple of things that we just did our company retreat, and for the Gen Zs who are, or whatever, Gen Xs, I had explained that there was a time, like when I started, we would get the data by modem, right? Remember that? Put the phone on, right? And you get the modem and you crunch numbers and software. Like even changes like that. And of course, now we get them in data sets and and we crunch it. There was a time, again, when everyone picked up a landline. And it wasn't just that everyone got cell phones. It was that how businesses, banks, everyone communicated, it was clogging up the phone lines, right? Now you don't want, it's not necessarily you don't want to take a poll. It's that you don't want to take a number you don't know, or it could be a bank, or it could be someone who's trying to, a marketer, et cetera. And so there just became so much clutter for your attention, which was a huge problem. But even with that, people always say, well, how do you actually get interviews? Are they relevant? Yes, they're statistically relevant. And I always use this as an example. People will always say, why do people come to focus groups? Well, I think
explain for anybody who doesn't know what a focus
a focus group
distinct
is. We
polling.
literally get 10 people, 12 people in a room, and we just have a conversation with them. And so, polling kind of
generally people of a kind of
we try to get a certain demographic, right? I mean, maybe they're swing voters, maybe they're Biden Trump voters, right? I mean, maybe they're all women, maybe they're blacks, maybe they're Hispanics, maybe they're young people, right? A lot of time we want to separate, it sounds weird, men and women, because there's always a 50-year-old white guy who wants to stand in a box and dominate. Oh, that's surprising. Wants to dominate, the conversation. And so to get a full conversation where there's no impediments, sometimes we just do all females and all males and things like that. But the whole thing about, I think, why people take interviews is often lost, which is we are high information voters. We are educated voters. And people ask our opinion all the time, right? People ask your opinion all the time. You have conversations, right? Whether it's your colleagues or whether it's fellow students or faculty, or whether it's, people, your colleagues at work. I would say that 80% of America, no one asks them a damn question. No one asks them their opinion. And so there is a certain public service to polling of hearing what real people, not that you're not real people, have to say. And I think it's important. And that's why it's actually still very successful. It's harder. The production rate is way down, but why it's important for us to keep kind of grinding this out. Like Tony and I said, Tony and I co-founded the Wall Street Journal poll. And one of the things that they wanted was a high quality poll. And there was a lot of media polls that aren't high quality. And so now we're doing what they call a multimodal,
expensive,
very expensive,
which is why a lot of media,
so we're doing a little bit of landline because there's some people who still use it. And then we're splitting up 75% of the interviews between live cell and text to web. And then lo and behold, we're still learning things that, these text to web interviews look a lot different than the other interviews, and people have a little bit more freedom, and they're not getting a certain bias from the interviewer to answer the same way. And so, we'll get more conservative responses from Black respondents and Hispanic respondents and so it's very, listen,
who
we're
aren't talking to a moderator.
What's that?
Who aren't talking to
a moderator. We found that, the hard to reach Trump voter wasn't going to pick up a phone and give an interview, but they would take it online in a certain way at their own time. And so we got to keep innovating, and we know that we have to keep innovating because each interview is very difficult.
Let me ask a different question. Go ahead, Tony.
And by the way, just to put a plug in for us, our final 2024 poll had President Trump winning the national vote by 2 points. He won by 1.3, whatever it was. And in 2022, our final generic ballot number was almost right on the nose, right?
It was.
So, I mean, when you do it, you do a quality sample, you have the right controls on it. I always say that media does polling to drive headlines and clicks. We do polling to drive strategy, messaging,
and we're a check and balance to each other.
Yeah.
Like, quite frankly, I mean, there's weighting. You get to decide, what's going to be the, party ID and the weights on demographics and stuff like that. And so, I mean, we look at it professionally rather than politically in terms of what we're doing. And, we put out stuff that looks different than other polls, and we trust that it's right.
One more methodological thing, and then I want to ask you, I want to dive into
You want to talk about politics?
I want to do that, yeah. I've avoided it as long as I can. Analytics is, we did not have, I mentioned big data before. When you're working for campaigns, you're talking about media organizations versus campaigns. You have your survey research, you have qualitative research, and then you have analytics, and you have an enormous amount of information about every voter. Talk about how all of that works together. And you guys had a particular strategy, which was to reach voters who were not regular voters. The larger the electorate, and I think both sides recognize this, the better Trump's chances, because he did better with irregular voters, people who did not vote in every election. And this has changed as, you know, the Democratic Party base has switched to a more college-educated base and so on.
Well, and John knows that, and I think you know, that I was never a big fan of analytics. I thought it was a lot of blue smoke and mirrors. And, you know, in 2016, when I did the Trump campaign, we had it, but the RNC kind of never really shared it with us because we were late to the party as the nominee and they did their own thing. In 2020, we had a whole bunch of it. And I would stress test the lists because I insisted on stress testing like the persuadable lists. And what I found is in all 4 stress tests that I did, 85% of the people that were on the persuadable list were definitely voting for Donald Trump or definitely voting for Joe Biden. And so it's like we're wasting 85 cents out of every dollar that we spend communicating with those voters. So heading into 2024, I insisted that we change everything we did with the analytics. And one of the things we did was every week we would pressure test and verify the analytics models. And I have to say that to give you an example of how on they were, when the early voters, the modeled early voters versus the actual people who say they voted in the surveys, every week we would match them up against each other. And in no week did the stated vote from the modeled vote vary by more than 1 point in any group. Now that's phenomenal when you think about it, that, you know, and one of the things our modeling and our surveys picked up were that the persuadable voters were less likely to vote. They were more focused on economics.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like Kamala Harris. They didn't necessarily like Donald Trump, but the delta between his job approval and his image was significant in that they thought he'd do a better job on economics. They weren't as concerned about all of the things that the Democrats were talking about, the trials and January 6th and all of the other things. It was really about their personal financial well-being. And that they were not consumers of regular news. They were not, they got their entertainment through streaming services, not regular TV sources, and therefore would be incredibly difficult to reach. They were users of TikTok, huge users of TikTok, huge users of Instagram, all of those places. So you saw our campaign migrate to those communication channels, and we're able to follow it through our analytics and through our polling to see the impact of it. In fact, today, the single largest political audience that TikTok has ever had, or views, whatever however you want to frame it, was the initial video that we put up, which was President Trump walking in with Jake Paul. You know who Jake Paul is? And they went face to face and they just stared at each other for like 10 seconds and then just bust out laughing. I think the whole video was maybe 30 seconds long, and it is still a busted TikTok the day it went up. So, you know, it was just a whole new way of using analytics to really dive deeply into what these people were using, plus all the consumer data we had on them on top of it.
So you could create profiles of every voter.
And not only did we have that, we also did a huge project of those people that were using the streaming services, and we came up with a group we called Streaming Persuadables. These are people who are persuadable voters that use streaming services that allowed advertising. And so we use CTV, connected TV, to target one-on-one with those people. So instead of doing like the Harris people did, where they basically did spray and pray, where they bought everything, we went and we bought on a very targeted basis the ads we wanted to reach those people in those groups.
It's interesting, John, because you were with me when I was working for Barack Obama. In 2012, we were on the leading edge of analytics.
Absolutely.
And we used set-top box data from cable TV, and we bought like 64 cable networks. I think the Romney campaign bought 9, because we understood that the voters who we needed to persuade were not watching television news.
Yep.
They were watching, Mayberry RFD at 3 in the
Yeah.
morning and other programming. And people said, why are you buying all that stuff? And it turned out to be very important.
When he was talking about this, it reminded me of 2012. And I would say that analytics, big data was in the infancy, really created by the Obama campaign. And it was the last time for Democrats, I believe it's worked. And I believe it's because Larry Grisolano, our friend and paid media director, kind of understood that the difference between polling and analytics, right? They each had their role. Tony explains it where there was actually some communication between the two, and the Democrats in 16 and 20 and 24 haven't figured that out. And Larry used to always say this one thing I always loved about pollsters and analytics in 12, which was the pollsters thought they understood analytics, and the analytics guys thought they were pollsters, right? And neither were right. And the fact is that we haven't got to where we've integrated the two to be a checks on each other. Right now, analytics in the Democratic world is kind of a black ops. Like they are off on their own in a silo, and it's a problem.
So let's talk about where we are right now. We're into 6 weeks or something of the Trump administration. He's speaking to the country tomorrow night. It's been a very active 6 weeks. I think we'd all agree, whether you like what the president's done or not. But I was interested, Tony, in a thing that you said about what drove people to Donald Trump, and particularly the persuadable voters who made the difference in the election. And that was economics. That was the cost of things and so on. It feels like there's been a flurry of activity since he took office, but not a lot of talk about that. Talk about, as a pollster, I'm just reading your mind here, but that's got to be a concern to you.
Well, yeah. First, I used to say all the time during the campaign, if this race is about performance and policy, we win. If this race is about personality and temperament, we lose. It's got to be about performance and policy, because you had 2 candidates that ended up not being very well liked, but one of them had a significant age when it came to key issues that were driving the electorate. Now, we're 6 weeks in, signed hundreds of executive orders on a whole host of things. And he's going to give the speech tomorrow night. And one of the things I've stressed to them is that, we've gained ground on immigration. They think he's doing a good job on immigration. They generally think he's doing a good job on foreign policy. They think he's doing a good job on crime. The one area where there still is a weakness is on inflation and personal financial security. And those are things that are a little bit tougher to communicate. Those are not communicate, but those are things that are tougher to get your arms around as quickly. It's easier to sign an executive order to say you're going to send troops to the border than it is to sign an executive order to say you're going to lower prices on eggs, or you're going to lower prices on gasoline. So one of the points that I've made is I think it's important to communicate how some of the things they've done thus far on energy production and things of that nature can help lower prices, and talk about what the plans are for the future to help lower prices. One of the things I tell reporters that ask me all the time, I tell them Rome wasn't built in a day. We need to address it. There's no question about it, but talk to me in a year. And let's see where we are in terms of where prices are, et cetera, et cetera. The other piece of this that I know you're going to raise is tariffs. Tariffs unexplained certainly cause a lot of heartburn for voters, because they believe that, what they hear is it's going to raise prices.
Well, because they kind of do.
Yeah. Well, but the experience from the first term was they didn't. And so the question then becomes, who defines what is going on quicker? Right now, the media's had kind of a little bit of a field day in defining that, you know, it's going to raise your prices or that it's punitive tariffs. When you hear the White House talk about it, or you hear the president talk about it, it's reciprocal tariffs. If Canada wants to charge us 25% on a product, we should charge Canada 25% on the product. There's no reason why we should be subsidizing them and they shouldn't be subsidizing us. The same thing with China, the same thing with Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of water is going to go underneath this bridge, I promise you. The question is going to be who gets there first and who gets to define it. But the proof is always in the pudding, and that is, what do people feel a year from now? I can tell you from my personal experience, in 2019, after all the tax cuts and everything, when we would ask people how they felt about their personal finances, the president would say to me all the time, well, what do you mean? The economy's doing great. Look at the stock market, blah, 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 blah. Probably the same stuff you heard from President Biden. And I would say to him, sir, unless they feel in their own pocketbook, the stock market's irrelevant. It's an outlier. Well, what about the 401k? They're thinking about that. But a year later, right before COVID hit, we had finally gotten to a point where voters started to feel it, and the numbers for the president started to turn, headed into early 2020 on the economy, because people felt like they had more money in their pockets. That's going to be what the judge is here. That's why I say in a year from now, let's revisit.
If you have a year, right? I mean, I think that's the what we're seeing is, you know, voters are, I don't know if I would call it contradictory. It's not unusual, but the fact is that we are not even in day 40. But what we're seeing is that, if I'm being honest here, which I am, is that
Thank you for that.
Voters love the action. Voters love the action right now of President Trump. They love that he's getting things done.
Yeah.
And they don't even have to necessarily agree with it, but there is a contrast, unfortunately, with President Biden, who they felt wasn't getting things done, wasn't up for the job. They never really saw him. There wasn't press conferences, et cetera, et cetera. So he's benefiting from the
They
fact.
might be seeing a little bit too much of us, but that's besides the point.
Well,
But, right. But the fact is, they love his strength. They feel like America is back, and they love that he's getting stuff done. On the other side, in the same focus group or the same poll, they will express anxiety about their number one issue. You know, people kind of understand that tariffs may mean that prices go up. They kind of get that, you know, if he gets his tax cut done, it's going to mean probably more for the rich than it is for them.
And they also go to the store and pay.
And they go, well, they go to the store. I mean, listen, I think in the last week, I watched the news every night with my son. We watch half hour of Lester Holt, half hour of Brett Baer. How about that? But the thing, stories on coffee going
Trying
up.
to impress me.
Story on coffee's
Last
going.
panel I did with him, he said
Oh.
half an hour Rachel Maddow.
No, I've never seen her. But literally, we've seen stories on coffee going up, eggs going up, and now beef going up. So I mean, it is what it is. But the fact is that they're concerned about that, and for the first time now we're hearing about, you know, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, like, because of the budget. I mean, that's really out there, and so, you know, they have challenges, right, on the issues that are super important. They may have a couple hundred executive orders, but most of that is, you know, noise, background noise. You know, the fact is, even quite frankly, Ukraine and what just happened is kind of background noise, because
There's the impression of action,
but it's
and
strength.
It's kind of general impression.
Yes.
It's not a,
And it's not at their number one issue.
yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, when we were in the White House, we were going through the Great Recession. And when President Obama was running for reelection, I mean, one of the things that you learn in the White House is there's so much that come at you, and so much you can do, that you can fill the airwaves with a lot of stuff. But if you don't concentrate on a specific message and drive it relentlessly, it all just sounds like noise, and people have the impression that you're not working on the thing that they care about. And it seems like, to me, there is for the reason you said, an upside for all of this activity after what people thought was a pretty somnolent kind of period with Biden, and he can live off that for a while. But the danger is you're doing all these things, but people begin to say, what about my thing?
Well,
And it's just not somnolent, and I'll let you go. It's that people thought that Biden's actions in the economy were hurting them. And that helps Trump right now.
So the flood the zone strategy was was done precisely to not give one target to shoot at. But the good news is that it worked. You flood the zone, and it really didn't give the Democrats opportunity to shoot at individual things because things were coming so fast
But
every
it gave
time.
them 100 things to take the bait on what wasn't.
Right, exactly.
Now, I want to ask you about that.
Right.
Go ahead.
But the bad news about it is that it also didn't allow you to focus on any one thing. And so now what has to happen is we have to shift to focusing on singular things and driving messages. And by the way, you raised something that just wasn't a problem or wasn't a learning for your White House. It's going to be a learning for this White House. It's like it gets relearned every time that you have to focus because the average voter is not paying attention the way you think they're paying attention. And the things that impact them on a daily basis, they don't need Brett Baer to tell them the price of beef is going up or the price of eggs are going up. They know it when they go to the grocery store. It's experiential. They may have to listen to find out what's going on in Ukraine, but they don't have to listen to find out what's going on when they go to the grocery store. That they live every day, or that interest rates are going up or coming down, or that, it's harder to buy a house or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. And well, on this point, and then I want to ask you about Democratic reaction to how Democrats deal with all of this. You have a president. I mean, I'm not going to diagnose him, but there is kind of an ADD-ish quality to him. You never know when you wake up in the morning what occurred to him the night before. But you find out when you look at Truth Social.
You're trying to bait me.
I'm just trying to give you facts. Facts. I'm asking you
Regular facts or
how. I mean, if the goal is to focus on one thing, how do you do that with a president who's all over the place?
It is a huge challenge. It was a challenge during the campaign. It will continue to be a challenge. Look, you're not going to change a 78-year-old guy who is, I will tell you, he runs us all into the ground. And we're all younger than him. I don't know where he gets his energy from. Frankly, I don't know where he gets his energy from. And he does have that ability to have multiple balls in the air and, change focus on what ball he's focusing on. And you get whiplash sometimes. Like we went from Ukraine to Gaza to, to this, to the other thing, to oil. It's crazy. But the thing that's different this time than than Trump won is the team around him is very, very focused on what should be done. The question is getting him to a place where he does that. Before, it was let Trump be Trump. I think you would all agree it's not so much let Trump be Trump in this administration. They will actually, just like in the campaign, try to focus where his energy and where his focus is.
Yeah, I think it's harder than in a campaign, though. I can just tell you from my own experience, because you can't control events in the way that you can in a campaign. When you're president of the United States, things are happening all the time that you have to react to.
I don't know, few indictments, a conviction, a shooting. I think we had some challenges during the campaign, keeping him focused.
We can talk about those probably profited you, all of those things during the course of the campaign. But John, what about this? What about the impulse to, because look, I mean, we have different views on some things. I care a lot about, I think, eliminating foreign aid is a mistake. I think it's a national security mistake. Forget about the humanitarian element of it, also bad. But from your own polling, that is not an issue that motivates a lot of voters. But the first thing that Democrats did was, and it was the first thing they chose to do, which was, I think, strategically sound was to go after foreign aid,
Right.
and you saw the reaction. What would you advise, based on your research, what would you advise, and what are you advising Democrats
Yeah.
right now to deal with the sort of blitzkrieg?
So I think you have to step back even before the reacting and understand that the foundational base of the Democratic Party's branding is at the lowest level it's been in, probably in my lifetime. And therefore, we don't really have the credibility to be a certain level critic on certain
Well,
issues.
go deeper.
But-
Why do you think the branding?
Yes. And so I went and saw Jason Isbell the other night. I don't know if you guys know him. He's a country singer. He has this great line, which he says, "They don't give a damn about the things I give a damn about." That's the Democratic Party right now in the view of voters, right? Because what they're seeing is the Democratic leaders marching to USAID headquarters, right? Or, the Democratic AGs, filing lawsuits for birthright citizenship, or, everything on illegal immigrants. I mean, I can go on and on, even Zelensky in Ukraine, transgenders, everything that they talk about are, again, not really what real people care about day in and day out. And so my recommendation would be not to take the bait on this type of stuff and have these press conferences where, Maxine Waters is talking or, railing against USAID or whatever the issue is, and literally stick to Trump's Achilles heel. Cost of living, right? The tax cuts for the rich, and what is really looks like cuts to Medicaid, possibly Social Security and Medicare. So the fact is that that's what I would be doing to build our brand to where we're credible, is to get back to not looking weak and woke, which is the number one words we get in focus groups or open-ended questions when we ask, what do you think of the Democratic Party? And get back to the other W, which when I started in this business is what people would say the Democratic Party stood for, which was working families. So, I mean, literally now the Republicans are the party of working families. This is crazy. So we have to literally step back and say our brand and working on that is more important than taking bait on USAID or taking even bait on Zelensky in Ukraine. Take the bait, well, not even take the bait, stand up every day and talk about what concerns and impacts working families. That's what I would do.
I think, first of all, I wish I could disagree with my Democrat colleague here, and I hope they don't take your advice.
Well, he's crapping all over his own party, so I didn't think you would.
No, but I mean, I hope they don't take his advice, and that would be a change of if they did actually. But I do think that there's another piece that, and you talked about USAID, but I think it's a broader thing, and that is, I think the Democrats just Pavlovian response to Elon Musk and being dismissive of government waste is a huge mistake. I think Elon Musk is just an actor in the play. I think the broader thing here is what they're trying to accomplish. And in every piece of research I have ever done, when you ask an average voter how many cents out of every dollar they think the federal government wastes, it hovers somewhere between 40 and 50 cents out of every dollar. So when you stand there and you tell an average voter that, no, we can't cut 10% out of these budgets, they look at you like, are you kidding me? You got to be kidding me. What happened to the $400 hammer? What happened to the $300? They do believe. And by the way, the areas they think are the most just rife with waste, USAID, foreign aid, the Pentagon, the IRS. I mean,
Listen, we want to sit there and argue that it's not much money, and it's not much money. But we want to argue that, which is ridiculous to the American people. And so,
I mean, let's just level set this. In most polling, you ask people how much of the budget goes to foreign aid, and they will say 25, 30%. The reality is like 1%. But in politics, what's the old expression when you're
perception is reality, and perception is reality.
At the minimum, if I was Democratic leaders, I would be standing up there and say, The national debt is too much. The federal budget, the yearly federal budget is too much, and it's bloated, and there's ways to be cut. Let's find a way to do that together in a way that is responsible. Start there. Acknowledge that, again, the goal is good. If you think that we're going to win elections, in 2026, railing on Elon Musk, I got another. Yeah, we're not. That's not where we're going to win.
By the way, let's go back. Let's take a walk down memory lane. 30 years ago, about this time, Bill Clinton was delivering a State of the Union address where he stood there and said, "The era of big government is over. The era of big government is over." And Bill Clinton went about reducing spending and getting us to the first point in I don't know how many years where we actually had a net surplus on spending over what the income was in the government.
Yeah.
The revenues were.
Yes. There were other elements there. I mean, the nature of the economy, the size of the deficits to start with, the fact that he raised taxes on the wealthy. So let's get back to that issue, because now you're sailing into this really challenging moment. And I presume the president's going to address this tomorrow night. And that is the tax cut. He wants to extend the tax cut that he passed in 2017, maybe deepen it, but certainly extend it. He'd like to make it permanent. If it's extended for 10 years, it's $4.5 trillion. And it will undoubtedly, the focus will be on the benefits that very wealthy people like you guys will derive from it.
A few other pieces. You're forgetting that we're going to add to that no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. So those three pieces there, at least two of those three pieces, are very much focused on working people. Okay. And so I agree with you. If we were just pushing for the tax cuts to just extend the 2017 tax cuts, which, by the way, people have pretty fond memories of because they think about it and they think they had money in their pocket then, okay? And you add to it the other tax cuts that are being talked about, then you've got a package that, at least perceptually, you could argue balances itself out. Now, in terms of the spending or in terms of the cuts that need to be made to fill that, I would take exception on I agree with you on the Social Security and Medicare. But Medicaid still has a problem. Medicaid to a lot of voters is associated with welfare. And as long as it is associated with welfare, voters will want work requirements. They'll want certain, they'll see it as a handout as opposed to something like Medicare that people have paid into and earned.
And this is incumbent upon the Democratic Party to clarify this. Like, we have to, and I think there's a big opportunity here, because most people on Medicaid are working families, children, seniors, grandma in the nursing home, and veterans and disabilities. So again, this is always a branding war, and Republicans are generally better at it than us. But we have a really good opportunity here to, drive this, clarify this, show that it's real people and working people.
The other element of this is, I assume there'll be talk about debt, and we have to cut the debt down and so on. Even if all the cuts are made, I think they're talking $2 trillion in cuts, you're still going to add several $1 trillion to the debt. So how does that?
Well, I mean, you're talking about cutting $2 trillion a year. Or $1 trillion a year. The tax cuts you're talking about cost $4.5 trillion over 10 years. So they cost you $450 billion a year. So really, when you take it on a year-by-year basis, if you cut $1 trillion out of the federal, by the way, the federal budget last year was $7 trillion. $7 trillion. If you cut $1 trillion out of it, you're cutting 15%.
Most of the, I mean, I don't want I don't want to get into a policy debate with numbers guys, but most of the federal budget goes to Social Security, Medicare, the programs we mentioned, service on the national debt. and military.
Right. We're
So,
gonna have to cut defense.
Which means it's impossible not to touch title.
Well, we're gonna have to cut defense. We're gonna have to cut some Medicaid. We're gonna cut the foreign aid, okay?
well, that'll be
Right,
not helpful. I mean, that's negligible.
right. But all of it adds up at the end of the day. Do they get to the $1 trillion a year that they're gonna try to offset in the tax cuts? You know, we could have the argument about supply side economics, whether or not cutting taxes actually increases tax revenues.
We've run that experiment several times.
And it did under and Trump, after the Trump 17 tax cuts, tax collections went up.
And under that time frame, under the 4 years of Trump, some of it having to do with the pandemic, but by no means all of it. 1/4 of the national debt he added.
Yeah.
1/4 of the national debt. So taxes, when you massively reduce revenues, it does have an impact.
It does. The other side of the coin is, and you're right, we've got a policy debate about it, is we continue, we raise taxes and we continue to spend what we're spending.
Yeah. No, I think the sweet spot is spend intelligently and invest in things that matter in people's lives. But John, what you just heard this is what the back and forth is going to be, probably a little less amiable.
And Democrats would miss an opportunity again to try to take part of their branding as fiscal responsibility. They've got to be, for some government cuts.
Yes.
I mean, that gives them credibility back.
Yes. But when you now the clock has stopped.
Uh-oh.
Started 5 minutes late, so we'll go 5 minutes beyond. I think I'm keeping everybody from pizza is what I'm doing. So there could be a riot here in a second. The point is there are trade-offs here, and that's where you were going before. Does Tony's argument carry the day, or does the argument?
No, I don't think it carries the day, because I think that, when I was doing Biden's polling in 2020 and after, when we asked that, 20 different economic, issues or policies, the one that always came to the top was making the wealthy and big corporations pay their fair share. And the fact is that the extension of the tax cuts and the Trump tax cut, 83% of all those benefits went to the wealthy and big corporations. So we have an opportunity, again, to define the extension. They were very smart on tipped wages and some of that other stuff. I mean, Tony and I both work for AARP and hope there's going to be a caregiving tax credit. But the fact is that I think that we have an opportunity to, again, define this debate of that they're giving a ton of money to the rich and big corporations. And where's it going to come from? It's going to come from Granny. It's got to come from somewhere. People are worried about the cuts to entitlements, and military is not entitlement. The fact is that if you take a look at the federal budget, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the interest on it, that must be 2/3 or more.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that at some point, if we're smart and just focus on these issues, we'll have an upper hand on this debate. And you're going to see this play out in the 2026 congressional election.
So I want you each to take in the couple of minutes we have left, I want you each to take a turn advising the other party. Tony, and disband is not a good answer. Okay. So let me just take that off the table. But Tony, if you were advising Democrats, what would you advise them? And John, if you were advising the Republicans, what are the dangers that you see for Democrats? And John, what are the dangers that you see for Republicans?
I think you all should have Maxine Waters and Ilhan Omar be your spokespersons on every issue and lead by whatever they want to talk about. I think that would be very enough. Look, I think if you all could focus on the economic issues, particularly the cost of living issues, I think short term and longer term, that would help. I mean, the problem with that is if things do improve, you know, then you got to switch it up quick. But right now, that seems to be the fertile territory. And on the tax cuts, I think you have to be a little careful on the tax cuts. And I would argue that I would advise you to be a little careful in the tax cuts. Voters already believe that Republicans are more likely to give tax cuts to the rich and to corporations, although that number is changing. And that number has changed from what it was 20 years ago to what it is today. And I think when you see things like tax on tips and things like that, you all have to be very, very careful about not wanting to include that stuff because it will further alienate you from working class voters. Stay away from that.
Well, I mean, listen, I don't think anything of my advice would happen, but I would actually tell them. I mean, they haven't even gotten the reconciliation bill passed, right? To fund
and we should
the
point out
2025.
reconciliation, for those who don't know, is a procedure in Congress whereby you can pass a bill having to do with budget issues
funding for 2025.
in a way that eliminates the possibility of a filibuster in the Senate. So you only need 51 votes in the Senate to pass the bill, or 50 plus the vice president.
The one beautiful big bill, as the president likes to say. And I mean, the advice I would get them, and they won't take it, would be to go and restructure which part of the 2017 tax cuts they actually should extend. And you could do it to where it's a smaller universe. It goes to the middle class. You save money for what you want to do, which is go reduce the national debt. And so, I mean, that would be a very smart play. And the second thing is I would do more of what you did today, which was announce the investments in foreign companies building plants here. I think it was one of the chip manufacturers from Taiwan. And the fact is that the economic narrative could be that what the Trump administration is doing is forcing American companies to rethink their business plans to keep manufacturing or bring manufacturing back to here. And what you guys did today is what I do more of.
Oh, there will be more of that.
Oh, I bet. Yeah.
I just want to say in closing, one of the things that's difficult in these times, these are very rancorous times, very polarized times. Whatever you think about Trump, he is a guy who cuts these issues very sharply. But we have to find a way to see each other in ourselves and to get along even when we have different views about how we should move forward as a country. And one of the reasons I like being with these guys is they have very different views on many different things, but they also have very similar backgrounds and they see the humanity in each other. And I think it makes them both better at what they do. And it is a spirit that we ought to try and inculcate our politics with more, because the one thing I know for sure is that we're going to rise or fall together as a country. And we need to recognize that. So I want to thank you guys for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you
for having us.
For having us.